The silence of a decade was shattered by a single notification on my screen. It was 11:30 p.m. in Chicago. The city lights, painting patterns across my drafting table, like a ghost of the life I had left behind.
Feed.
Am Grant Morgan, and for 11 years I have built skylines for other men while burying the memory of the cedar-scented workshop in Maine where my father, Samuel Morgan, once breathed life into wood.
Came the email from my mother.
Attached was a release form for the sale of my father's legacy, accompanied by a pathetic offer of $10,000. A second notification buzzed a message from Jace Rourke,
BT.
the son of the con man my mother married, shortly after Dad's heart stopped. Nostalgia's "Doesn't Pay the Bills, Brother," he had written Sing the Lawyers. Don't stand in the way of progress.
Picked.
I set my glass of rye down without a tremor in my hand. I didn't feel rage. I felt the cold, sharp clarity of a blade being honed.
Fact.
They thought I was a distant memory, a son who had traded the salt air for the comfort of a steel and glass loft. They had no idea that I held the keys to the kingdom they were trying to dismantle.
Busey.
I opened my archives, my fingers dancing over files I hadn't touched in years. There it was, the restrictive covenant I had helped my father draft when I was just 19.
Fengson.
A legal Iron Maiden that protected the workshop from corporate greed. I checked my bank statement, $85,000 in restoration funding paid by me.
Fingsy.
Secretly, over the last 4 years, to keep the taxes current and the title clear, I was the silent owner. They were just tenants in a house of cards. I pulled out my father's brass compass from the bottom drawer, its needle steady and true. I booked a flight to Portland, leaving before the sun even dared to break the horizon.
Busey.
When I arrived at the old house, the air felt thick with the scent of pine and betrayal. Mom opened the door, her face a mask of nervous irritation, but it was Dale Rourke who stepped forward. Fists clenched his ego, filling the room like rot. You aren't welcome here, Dale snarled, trying to loom over me. This property is under contract, and you're just a ghost from a past we've already erased. I didn't blink.
You just
Watched him, noticing the cheap imitation of my father's workspace he had already begun to construct in the yard. You're selling wood, Dale, I said, my voice cutting through the morning fog like a lighthouse beam.
You're standing on land that doesn't belong to you.
You, he laughed, a shallow, hollow sound. We have the buyer. We have the signatures of the living. And your opinion doesn't carry the weight of a dying man's ghost.
Picked.
I pulled the heavy leather-bound folder from my bag and dropped it onto the counter. The thud was heavy final. Actually, I said, stepping past him into the shop, I have the deed.
Use at ye.
I walked to the center of the workshop, where the shavings of cedar still carpeted the floor, a sacred space he had tried to turn into a souvenir shop for tourists. I opened the document to page 8.
Feasing.
The restrictive use covenant. I began, my voice echoing against the rafters. It states that this land can only be used for the production of handcrafted wooden vessels using traditional methods.
Fission.
I looked at Jace, who had walked in his phone out ready to record his triumph. That fiberglass garbage you're building in the yard, it violates every clause of this deed.
Ing.
The color drained from Dale's face as he scrambled to look at the paperwork. I'll sue you, he stammered, his bravado crumbling.
Try.
I replied. But already sent the proof of your unauthorized industrial manufacturing to the state zoning board and the historical society. The twist hit them harder than a physical blow.
You'd.
I hadn't just come back to stop the sale. I had come back to trigger the reversion clause because they had breached the covenant by attempting to sell the land for non-traditional use. Property was legally clawed back into the estate, which, according to the original trust, reverted entirely to me in the event of a breach. You don't own this house, Dale, I said, closing the folder.
Finishin.
And as of 10 minutes ago, you're officially trespassing on my property. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of justice.
Busey.
My mother looked at me, her eyes finally, seeing the man I had become, not the boy who had run away. She had chosen a shark, thinking he would bring her wealth, only to realize he had brought the roof down upon them.
Voden. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to fight.
I simply watched as they packed their bags in the pouring rain, the luxury brand they tried to build, dissolving into nothingness.
Fashion.
I stood in the center of my shop, the brass compass in my pocket, feeling the legs a steady pull of the needle. It was in the integrity of the work.
For the first time in 11 years, the shop was mine again.
I walked to the drafting table, picked up a pencil, and began to design the future one that was finally built on solid ground.
Realized.
Isn't about getting even. It's about making sure that what is built on lies eventually returns to the dust from which it came.
Ease.
I leaned back, breathed in the salt air, and knew that the water would continue to mark the hull long after I was gone. The deal was dead. The workshop was silent.
For the first time in a long time, the silence was perfect.
The cabin lights dimmed, casting long dancing shadows against the bulkhead as the plane sliced through the dark Michigan sky. I stared at my screen, the glow reflecting in my eyes, cold and focused. My thumb hovered over the folder labeled for court and for laughs.
Digital.
Tombstone for everything Jace Rourke had tried to build on the foundation of my father's legacy. My father, Samuel Morgan, had spent his life carving perfection out of cedar and oak.
Fend.
His hands as mapping the history of the Maine coastline into every vessel. Now that history was being sold at a discount by a man who didn't know the difference between a hand-forged chisel and a factory-pressed mold.
Restrictive use covenant was my ace in the hole.
A legal document buried in the county records that demanded handcrafted integrity and absolute transparency. If Jace so much as touched a piece of prefabricated fiberglass, he was in breach of a contract that would dismantle his entire operation brick by brick.
I had the proof.
Screenshots of his heritage boats showing Phillips screws, particle board frames disguised as oak, and the glaring financial discrepancies, where bank transfers for quality materials never reached the contractors. I wasn't just angry. I was systematic.
Injustice.
Much like a well-cut joint, required precision. As the plane began its descent toward Portland, the clouds broke, revealing a jagged coastline that looked like the teeth of a saw.
Phantom weight in my pocket, my father's. Old brass compassed.
Only thing he'd left me that didn't involve wood or salt water. It was a reminder that no matter how much Jace tried to steer the narrative,
Vein.
the magnetic north of the truth remained unchanged. The wheels of the plane touched down with a shuddering metallic groan, a sound that felt like a gavel striking a courtroom bench.
You.
I didn't wait for the plane to fully reach the gate before I hit send on the email to Harlan Vega, my attorney. File the injunction, I whispered to the empty air. Pot 8 a.m. meeting.
Fenty.
The confirmation buzzed on my screen, a small, satisfying vibration against my palm. The drive north toward the coast was a blur of gray asphalt and pines that stood like silent sentinels, guarding the secrets of my past.
Efficient.
When the turnoff finally appeared, my stomach tightened. The hand-painted sign that had stood for 40 years was gone. In its place was a monstrosity of chrome letters bolted onto cheap plywood. Rourke Marine.
Fixed.
The gate swung open, creaking in the wind, and I pulled my truck onto the gravel, the crunching sound echoing like breaking bones.
U10.
The workshop, the temple where my father had taught me, the architecture of soul and wood looked hollow. The air, once filled with the honest scent of sawdust and cedar,
Fiend.
was thick with the biting stench of chemical resins and industrial solvents. I stepped out, my boots heavy against the ground, and was as immediately met by Dale Rourke,
Beak.
who waddled toward me with the misplaced confidence of a man who thought he owned the horizon. Grant Morgan. He barked, his voice straining to be heard over the hum of a cheap air compressor.
Fex didn't expect to see the prodigal architect back on the docks.
He adjusted a branded polo shirt that struggled to contain his ego, his eyes darting toward a group of workers who looked more like extras on a movie set than actual shipwrights. It's a nice empire. You've built Dale, I said, my voice cutting through the noise, flat and devoid of warmth.
Fiend.
His grin, widened, teeth white and predatory. It's my empire now, Grant. The investors love the aesthetic, and we're taking this place into the 21st century.
You.
Behind him, Jace appeared holding a smartphone like a holy relic, broadcasting his empty performance to an online audience. Heritage meets innovation, Jace recited into the camera.
Fent.
tossing a handful of artificial sawdust over a piece of particle board that was spray painted to look like vintage oak. I walked over, picked up a piece of the dust from the workbench, and rolled it between my thumb and forefinger.
Making the sawdust now, Jace.
I looked at him, not with the rage he expected, but with the pity one reserves for a terminal failure.
You're broadcasting a lie.
To people who actually care about the craft, and the thing about lies is that they don't hold up in the salt air.
Faces.
Smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, the algorithm-driven confidence flickering as he saw the folder I held tucked under my arm.
It's just business, bro.
He stammered the word, sounding hollow in the vast, sterile room.
Feed.
No, I replied, opening the folder to reveal the stamped, notarized injunction that would freeze his assets before the next tide hit the shore.
Easing.
This is a forensic audit of your failure, and by the time the sun hits noon, there won't be a single piece of this heritage facade left standing.
Figged.
The color drained from Dale's face, turning the arrogant tycoon into a frightened middle-aged man in a cheap shirt. We had an agreement, he spluttered, his voice cracking.
A restrictive covenant that you ignored.
Because you thought you could outsmart the law, I said, turning my back on them to walk toward the main bay doors.
Fent.
Outside the ocean rolled in eternal and indifferent to the games of men. I took the compass from my pocket and watched the needle point north, fixed and true.
View.
The reckoning had arrived, and for the first time in years, the shop felt like it was finally mercifully breathing again.
Eunice.
The air in the workshop was stagnant heavy, with the stench of cheap chemicals that clung to the back of my throat.
Fingit.
I reached down and scooped up a handful of sawdust from the floor, letting the coarse particles sift through my fingers. This wasn't the fragrant, honest dust of cedar or seasoned oak that my father had built his reputation on.
Pressed wood.
Held together by toxic glue and lies. I looked at Jace, who was currently framing a shot for his social media feed. You're even faking the sawdust now, Jace?
Feed.
I asked, my voice cutting through the hollow silence of the shop. Jace flashed a grin that didn't reach his eyes, his thumb hovering over the record button. Gotta feed the algorithm, bro. Engagement is everything.
You.
The term bro felt like a slap in the face. I didn't offer him the satisfaction of a response, choosing instead to look toward the office doorway where Claire stood. She looked thin, almost translucent, her posture rigid, as if she were bracing for a physical blow.
Grant,
she whispered, her voice sounding like a language she had long ago forgotten how to speak.
didn't tell us you were coming.
I didn't think I needed an invitation to visit my own legacy, I replied, my eyes fixed on the gray industrial paint job covering the once beautiful rafters.
Dean.
She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, trying to project a confidence she clearly didn't possess. This isn't a fight, Grant, it's just business. You walked away, remember? You abandoned this place.
You.
I held up a hand, silencing her, before she could continue her script. Don't try to rewrite history. Mom, I built a life of my own, while you built this. I gestured to the soul-crushing expanse of the warehouse.
You Dale Rourke.
Let out a loud, forced sound that rattled the rafters. Your old man was a stubborn dinosaur. Dale said, stepping into my personal space, fused to move with the times, a great craftsman maybe. But he died with nothing, he was dead weightum, just cleaning up the mess. My heart rate remained perfectly steady, though my blood was boiling.
You mean you're cashing out before the roof caves in?
Dale poked a thick finger into my chest. Watch yourself, son. I am not your son, I said, cold and direct. That hit a nerve.
Face.
Darkened, his jaw tightening into a hard, uneven line. Jace stopped filming, smirking behind his device. You city guys love acting tough once you're on safe ground, huh?
Ignored him.
Entirely choosing to walk the perimeter of the facility. My eyes scanned every beam and every joint, cataloging the devastation. Every imperfection whispered a tragedy of lost skill.
Thinked.
The uneven, hurried brush strokes on the paint, the missing lathe work, the scars on the floor where my father's workbench had stood for 30 years. The grain of the original oak still fought to breathe beneath the suffocating layers of gray primer. Did you paint him over the white oak? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Looks cleaner. Dale grunted, following me like a shadow.
Cleaner.
I repeated. You buried a lifetime of craftsmanship under cheap store-bought. Primer times change. Dale snapped. No, I countered, looking him dead in the eye. People just get lazier.
Face let out a sharp, mocking laugh.
You really think anyone left in this world gives a damn about handcraft?
I do.
I said, stepping closer, and unfortunately for you, the law does too.
Fact.
Claire shifted nervously, her heels clicking against the concrete. Grant, don't start threatening people. I turned to her, my expression hardened by the realization of what she'd allowed.
Threatening him.
Simply reminding you of the restrictive covenant you signed. Dale barked, a sound of pure arrogance.
Flaws is ancient history.
It won't hold up. I've got investors who have lawyers that eat those kinds of documents for breakfasts. Then they're going to choke on this one. He puffed out his chest. But I was already heading for the office. The room smelled like stale coffee and failure. A flickering monitor displayed spreadsheets titled Rebrand Marketing Q1.
Fugan read it.
The numbers were bleeding red in every single column. A line item buried deep in the records caught my eye. Asset liquidation prep. On another tab, I saw a personal account being funneled to an offshore bank.
Freed.
Beside the desk, there was a plastic bin overflowing with things that belonged in a museum, not a trash heap.
That.
My father's drafting pencils. His brass bevel gauge.
Photograph of him standing proudly beside the first boat he ever sold.
I reached out, brushed the gray dust from the glass, and slid the photo into my folder. That's private property.
Phoebes Nye.
Dale shouted from the doorway, his face flushing red. You're trespassing. I didn't even look back at him. I pulled out my phone and began photographing every corner of the room.
Vet.
The gray beams. The shoddy fixtures, the fake kits masquerading as custom work. Each image was automatically timestamped and geotagged.
You.
I crouched by a stack of cheap, thin fiberglass hulls, snapping a close-up of a hairline crack in the resin. Documentation, I said, standing up and sliding my phone into my pocket.
Be back with the paperwork to shut this entire operation down.
Claire's voice trembled behind me. Why are you doing this to us, Grant? Why ruin everything? You ruined him, I said, tapping the folder against my palm.
Finishing the job.
Your pathetic Dale, spat his confidence, finally flickering. You lawyers love your drama, but when the bills pile up, you'll be begging to sell this place to me for pennies.
You.
Jace was recording again, his camera pointed right at my face. Ladies and gentlemen, catch the prodigal son who couldn't make it in the family business, coming back to lecture us on boat building. Absolutely riveting stuff.
Fix.
I walked right past him, not even giving him the courtesy of a glare. Keep filming. Jace, it'll just make my job easier when I'm in front of the judge.
Feud.
The parking lot was empty save for my truck and a forklift they had intentionally blocked the exit with. A petty, childish power play. Dale stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, waiting for me to lose my temper.
I walked to the forklift.
Pulled the key from the pegboard they'd left hanging in the shop. Started it and moved it exactly 10 feet out of my way.
Binged.
I set the brake, left the key dash, and took a photo of the obstruction for the court files. Then I pulled out no angry horn, no screeching tires, just cold, calculated composure.
Binged.
Dale was still shouting about property rights as I drove toward the gate. Claire called out, but her voice was swallowed by the coastal wind.
Fanged.
I stopped at the edge of the property where the cheap chrome-plated sign squeaked in the breeze. I took one final photo of it against the morning sky. Then I drove toward the highway, the scent of the marina fading behind me.
Phone buzzed in the cup holder.
It was a text from Harlan Vega.
Call me when you've seen the files.
I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The gray paint, the fake oak, the borrowed pride.
Ribbed him.
It was all just a facade, the kind of structure that would crumble the very second it faced a real storm. I sent a short reply. It's worse than I imagined building the case now.
Easy.
I turned onto the main road, the compass in my pocket steady as I headed north. The motel room smelled like salt and ancient carpet, but it was quiet.
Fend.
I spread the documents across the table, the evidence of their betrayal laid bare. Harlan arrived 10 minutes ahead of schedule, his coat damp from the Oregon rain. He didn't bother with small talk.
Finked.
Claire signed the authorizations at dawn. Harlan said opening his laptop. The DAS office pushed the subpoenas through on an emergency basis. Bank compliance provided the statements by noon.
Fees him.
He tapped a key, and a list of transactions appeared. The $85,000 you sent disappeared in 4 quick steps. Harbor Credit Bayview Savings, Ledge Point Capitality, moved it into Dale's personal account.
Fiend it.
I looked at the paperwork, my vision blurring with fury. Between the artisan clause in the original deed and the photos of the fraudulent stock, the judge granted an ex parte temporary restraining order. Harlan continued.
Vet.
They can't sell, move, or touch a single piece of equipment until the hearing. You weren't exaggerating, he said, pulling up a specific file.
Forged your mother's signature.
On a refinance, using it to secure a private high-interest loan. I flipped through the pages. There it was, me mother's elegant signature clearly traced on a document dated 18 months ago.
Fink. The lender.
Zanua Shelcom with predatory rates that practically guaranteed default. And the restoration money I sent? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Diverted, Harlan said grimly.
Fint.
Your $85,000 never saw a single piece of lumber. They used it to pay off Dale's gambling debts.
Don't.
I leaned back, the weight of the betrayal finally settling in.
They hadn't just stolen money.
They had stolen the legacy of a man who couldn't defend himself. Harlan, I said, my voice cold. I want them to pay for every single inch of that shop.
Fixed.
And I want them out before the sun sets on that facility tomorrow. Harlan smiled, the first genuine expression I'd seen on his face all day.
Thing Vrin.
Don't worry, Grant, the court order is absolute. By tomorrow morning, the locks will be changed and the marshals will be waiting. The silence in the room was no longer heavy with sassiness, but with the sharp, clean edge of justice.
Tomorrow the facade would
Finally come crashing down. The silence of a small town is a lie. It's not peaceful. It's just a place where secrets have room to breathe until they suffocate you.
Father spent his life
Building a legacy with his own hands, Rourke Marine. But when I came home, I didn't find a heritage. I found a crime scene, and the people who were supposed to protect it,
they were the ones holding the knife.
I stood in my motel room, the air thick, with the smell of cheap coffee and old dust. Harlan Vega, my investigator, had just laid it all out.
For Dale.
Hadn't just mismanaged the business, he had gutted it. A shell company fabricate interest rates. And my $85,000 restoration fund vanished. Gone into a personal credit line, and Claire, my own mother. She claimed ignorance, signing every fraudulent document Dale slid under her nose. Blinded by her desperate need to keep the perfect family image alive. The next morning, the local paper dropped the bomb.
Headline, burned like acid.
Architect sues grieving mother over family workshop.
Shot.
Jace, the local opportunist and my brother's lapdog, had spun the narrative perfectly.
Fuji.
I was the Chicago snake, the greedy son coming back to destroy Maine craftsmanship. By noon, the diner was a battlefield. The waitress slammed my plate and a regular customer stared at me with pure, unfiltered hatred.
Vid fight back.
I didn't explain. I just kept a folder labeled false narrative and added every clipping, every smear, every lie. I knew the truth wasn't something you shouted. It was something you proved.
Fint.
Came the knock on the door, rather the lack of one. My Aunt Marianne, my mother's sister, had summoned me. She didn't offer tea or comfort. She handed me a box. Inside wasn't just dust, it was history.
Original
deeds, verified signatures, and receipts from decades ago, notarized and untouched. He trusted me, she whispered, looking at my father's signature unique break in the letter S from his old injury.
Fingsled.
I don't like who my sister has become, but you need to finish what he started. That night, the intimate state started. A flat tire, a board of rusted nails placed strategically behind my truck.
Amateurish, childish, and pathetic.
I didn't panic. I filed the report, took the photos, and texted Harlan. They're getting slapping sloppy. I called Claire for one final meeting.
Fint.
She came in wearing dark glasses, trying to hide behind a mask of victimhood. Why are you doing this to us, Grant? She pleaded. Her voice trembling. Dale is under pressure.
He isn't under pressure, Mom.
I said, my voice cold as the Maine winter. He's committing fraud, and you're his willing accomplice. She threatened me. warned me that I'd regret it.
Just watched her leave.
Her Halfall cup vibrating on the table. She thought she was fighting for a family. She was actually fighting for a fraud the morning of the final confrontation. The air was sharp and gray.
Ishan.
I pulled into the Rourke Marine lot. Harlan was right behind me, and in the rear view, the flashing lights of Sheriff Cal Danner's cruiser cut through the fog.
From a forklift, his face turning from arrogance to ash when he saw the law.
"You're trespassing!" Dale shouted, scrambling toward us. "This is private property." "Not anymore," I said, stepping out.
Yishing.
Jace was there, 2 camera out filming for his little audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, he preened the city boy is here to destroy our heritage." Sheriff Danner moved in his expression unreadable.
Thinked.
I looked at Dale, then at Claire, who stood trembling beside him. I handed the folder to the sheriff. "Injunction," I said, my voice echoing across the gravel artisan clause.
Ichu.
And the original signatures from Samuel Morgan certified and notarized.
Dot.
Dale's phone dropped from his hand as the sheriff read the document aloud. The court had frozen everything.
Fix.
The arrest warrant for the forged refinancing was already signed. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and sweet. The camera was still running, but Jace had stopped talking.
He had wanted to
film a villain, but he ended up capturing the exact moment justice arrived. I looked at my mother, her eyes wide with the realization that the man she protected had sold her out long before I arrived.
Didn't smile. I didn't gloat.
I simply looked at the sign that said Rourke Marine and knew that for the first time in years, the foundation was finally solid. The lie had hit the wall of truth, and it had shattered.
Thick. Case closed.
The air at the harbor was heavy thick with the scent of salt and the impending storm. I stood there, the weight of the moment pressing against my chest as I handed the thick manila folder to Sheriff Danner.
The ink on the documents was sharp.
The signatures of Samuel Morgan on authentic and verified by local records, each one bolstered by the stone-cold testimony of Marianne Holt.
Easy.
I glanced over at Dale, watching the color drain from his face, and then flood back in an angry, mottled purple. Harlan opened the second, smaller folder and began to read, his voice cutting through the humid air like a blade. Forgery of a partner's signature, the illegal draining of restoration funds, and a refinance scheme built entirely on a foundation of lies.
Funneled the capital.
Through Shell, accounts Mr. Rourke, and we have the paper trail to prove it. Dale stepped forward, his eyes wild, his voice trembling with a frantic, desperate rage.
This is my facility.
He spat, pointing a shaky finger at me. "You cannot do this. This is nothing but blatant slander." Harlan didn't flinch, his expression immovable as stone.
Physical L. You evidence to back it up.
Jace, lurking in the shadows, kept his camera trained on us, his knuckles white as he gripped the device.
He is lying to all of you.
Jace shouted, his voice cracking. "Grant is nothing more than a bitter, jealous man who couldn't hack it in the real world." I turned slowly, fixing my gaze directly into the glass eye of his camera lens.
Finn.
This isn't about greed, and it certainly isn't about jealousy. This is about protection, because my father didn't just build this company, he poured his life into every joint and beam.
Bankton.
You, on the other hand, only tried to dismantle it with your hollow promises. Sheriff Danner didn't raise his voice, yet his authority filled the space between us.
You can keep that camera
rolling if you want, but know that every second of this footage is now evidence, and I want a copy sent to my station immediately.
Second.
Jace went silent, the audacity of the sheriff hitting him harder than any shout ever could. Dale lunged, his face contorted into a mask of pure spite. "You think you're better than me, Grant."
You crawl back here after abandoning this place, thinking you deserve a seat at the table. You get nothing.
I looked him dead in the eye, feeling a strange, hollow peace.
Vent.
"I already have everything that actually matters," I said, my voice steady. The sheriff pulled the warrant from his vest, the paper crinkling in the wind.
Probable cause
for the fraudulent refinance, and the misappropriation of funds is clear. Danner stated calmly, "Dale Rourke, you are officially under arrest for fraud, forgery, and the theft of company assets."
Thick.
He signaled to his deputies, who moved in with practiced silent efficiency. "Step aside," the sheriff ordered, Dale let out a jagged, ugly laugh, his composure finally shattering.
Cannot do this to me.
Claire.
Tell them the truth. Tell them this is our legacy.
Claire stood off to the side, her hands clutched to her chest, trembling violently as the reality of the situation washed over her.
Dale, please?
She whispered, her voice barely audible. He spun on her, his eyes cold and accusing. Don't you dare start with me now. The cuffs clicked a sharp metallic snap that echoed through the harbor.
Bent.
Dale fought against the hold, twisting his body as he screamed toward me. You will regret this, Morgan, you hear me. The sheriff didn't respond, simply guiding him firmly toward the back of the cruiser.
Ben.
I didn't say a word because my silence was the sharpest rebuke I could offer. Behind me, Claire's voice cracked under the weight of the day. Grant, what have you done to this family?
Vixie.
I turned to look at Toad, seeing her mascara running down her face in dark, jagged rivers. You've destroyed everything all for a bit of pride, she sobbed. You're exactly like him, cold, stubborn, and completely impossible to love.
Finction.
I looked at her with pity, but no regret. No, I'm like him. Because I know how to build things that are meant to last.
Thing.
You chose a gambler over a craftsman, a fantasy over the truth, and you don't get to hold me responsible for the wreckage of your own choices.
Dean.
She flinched, as if it struck her, then ripped the gold band from her finger and hurled it at me. It hit my chest with a dull thud and tumbled into the gravel.
From.
I didn't bother to pick it up, leaving it right where it lay in the dust. The crowd gathered at the fence had gone deathly quiet, the locals and former crew members watching the scene with wide, unblinking eyes.
Agent.
As the sheriff shoved Dale into the cruiser, the word forgery seemed to ripple through the air, traveling from person to person like an electric current.
Tens.
Heads turned, whispers erupted, and the entire narrative of the last few years was being rewritten right there on the gravel. Dale roared from the back seat, but the door slammed shut, cutting him off mid-sentence. Face stood by the trailer, his face a mask of shock and growing dread. This isn't the end, he muttered, his voice barely of breath. You have no idea what is coming for you. Then make it interesting, I replied.
Because taking you down was the easiest thing I've done all year.
He glared at me, then scrambled into his car, his tires spitting gravel and dust as he peeled out of the lot.
Fiji.
Claire collapsed onto the edge of the trailer, her shoulders heaving with muffled sobs. I almost reached out to her, but the impulse died as quickly as it had come. Harlan touched my shoulder, his grip firm and grounding.
Eatsing.
Rhett, we need you at the clerk's office at 9 sharp for the formal statement. He'll be there, I promised. We walked toward our vehicles, the atmosphere thick with the stares of the townspeople.
From.
I caught the eye of an old fisherman I'd known for years, and he gave me a single, slow nod of respect. Truth moves fast in a small town, but it moves even faster when it's finally backed by justice.
Fixed.
The sheriff's lights swept across the gray siding of the workshop, painting the walls in rhythmic flashes of blue and red. Jace remained by the trailer, his phone clutched in his hand, his skin the color of ash. Two deputies walked toward him, their expressions unreadable. We're going to need you to come in for questioning, son. Jace offered a sickly fake smirk, still trying to project an air of control.
Vim. Sure, I'm happy to clear this up.
They didn't cuff him, but they didn't have to. He knew he had no choice. By noon, the footage was all over the internet.
Bing.
The comment sections were a flurry of activity, with people sharing the moment I told him. My father built this place with his own hands.
BT.
Jace's expensive, glossy promo videos became the butt of every joke, his reputation disintegrating in real time.
From it.
By the evening, the investors had pulled their funding. His phone had stopped ringing, and he had wiped his social media accounts clean.
Vin.
A week later, his car was gone, and rumors swirled that he'd bought a one-way bus ticket to Boston, babbling about a fresh start.
Finks.
I stood in the lot that morning looking at a flyer, still taped to a fence poster's face, bright and arrogant, beside the Rourke Marine logo.
Phasey.
The wind caught the corner of the paper, peeling it away, leaving the face torn and unrecognizable. That is how it ends for men like him, a lot of noise and then silence.
Fendim.
But I knew he wasn't truly finished, because men like Jace don't know how to exist without a scheme. Weeks later, the headlines were unavoidable. Rourke pleads guilty to fraud and forgery sentencing, pending assets seized.
Faciem.
As part of the settlement, Claire signed over her half of the property, a final surrender of the life she thought she wanted.
Izod.
Harlan walked the deed to the clerk, and when the stamp hit the paper, the finality of it felt like a weight lifting off my chest.
View.
Claire was listed as a cooperating witness moving in with Marianne, finally starting the long road toward therapy. With Dad's half from probate and hers signed over, the title was finally clean, and it belonged to me.
Foggy.
One foggy morning, I walked through the quiet lot, the old Rourke Marine sign dangling by a single rusted bolt, squeaking in the breeze. I tore it down and threw it into the bed of my truck.
View.
The name Morgan Boats would return, but it had to earn its place again from the ground up. Inside the gray paint was a suffocating layer over the oak, the air still reeking of cheap resin and broken dreams.
Reasons.
I cracked open a can of varnish remover, feeling the bite of the chemicals, and got to work. Slowly, the golden grain of the wood began to breathe again under my hands.
Theme.
I scraped until my arms ached and my lungs burned, sanding every surface, until the boards were smooth enough to mirror my reflection. I replaced every bolt with marine-grade steel, testing each one with precision torque.
Felt different.
Now, no longer a monument to a fraud, but a workshop, waiting for a craftsman to bring it back to life.
Fiend it.
I stood back, watching the light hit the polished oak, and for the first time in years, the harbor felt like home again. The air in the workshop was heavy, thick, with the scent of raw cedar and the ghosts of my father's craft. I worked until my palms were raw, scraping away the decay of years sanding, until the grain finally surrendered to my touch.
Failure.
Every rusted bolt was a failure of the past. I replaced them all with marine-grade steel, torquing each one until my wrist screamed.
Vino.
The shop floor had buckled under the weight of cheap resin and neglect, so I jacked it up inch by inch, listening to the wood groan as it found its original level.
Isnai.
Time didn't matter. There was only the rhythm of the grind, the wipe of the cloth, and the constant punishing rebuild.
Huge.
I bled. On the workbench more than once, just taped the knuckle and kept moving, a quiet testament to the man I was trying to honor.
Fest.
There was a moment of frustration where I cursed the rot, then laughed at the sheer absurdity of it. The workshop seemed to laugh with me, the high ceilings, catching the sound of real, honest labor.
Fast in a town
that's been starved of pride, and by the end of the week, the silence at my door was broken.
Human.
Walt Kinney, the man who had been my father's right hand for 30 years, stood there with two retired shipwrights, their faces weathered like the oak beams they used to shape.
Butte.
They didn't offer empty platitudes or apologies for their long absence. Walt just looked at the chaos, eyed, tidied, and muttered, "You finally came home."
Fitted.
I handed him a scraper without a word, and he stepped into the light, falling into the rhythm of the wood as if he'd never left.
Thinky.
The tension of the past, the betrayal, by the Rourkes, the lies that had poisoned this town, dissolved into the simple grounding sound of hammer hitting chisel.
Feed.
By the second week, the town's collective stare had softened. The diner owner didn't look through me anymore. And a thermos of hot coffee appeared on my doorstep every morning like clockwork. Small silent offerings started arriving, a box of faded photographs from neighbors. Pictures of my father's boats, proof that his legacy hadn't been erased, just buried.
Ishi.
Then, while I was leveling a section of the subfloor, my hammer hit a hollow spot that shouldn't have been there.
Picked.
I pried up the board and found a hidden compartment, a small cache wrapped in oilcloth that hadn't seen the light of day in decades.
Ishin.
Inside were my father's favorite chisels, the handles worn to the shape of his grip, and his heavy wooden mallet scarred from 1,000 frames.
This.
At the very bottom, buried under the tools, sat a thick sealed envelope, addressed to no one, written in a hand I knew better than my own. I sat on the dusty floor, my heart hammering against my ribs, and read the short, firm words. "You came back. The place needed you. More than the world did. Build what stands storms. And when you don't know the path, just do the next right thing."
Fitno.
Flowery sentiment, just a cold, hard compass I had been missing my entire life.
Fiend.
I pressed my hand against the paper, feeling the weight of his expectation, then placed the tools on the bench right where they belonged.
Defeated.
6 months later, the schooner was a masterpiece of salt-hardened timber, and pride catching the dawn light with the grace of a living thing.
View.
Outside the sign for the Samuel Morgan Institute of Artisan Craft stood straight, no longer smelling of the synthetic rot of the Rourkes, but of honest cedar and varnish.
Fushi.
The crowd on the dock was small, but they were the people who mattered Walt the crew, and even those who had once turned their backs on me.
Binged.
Tessa Vaughn from the local paper hovered near the edge, her notebook out, already drafting the headline that would rewrite history. Morgan legacy restored.
Finishing.
I didn't need to speak. I checked the ballast and the rigging, honoring my father's belief that attention to detail was the highest form of respect.
Fees.
A car door slammed behind me, and the air shifted instantly. My mother stood at the edge of the dock, her posture broken, clutching a small wooden box.
EBIT.
She looked at me, her eyes hollow with the realization of the choices she'd made, and whispered, "I don't expect your forgiveness. I just needed to see that you finished his work."
Things it.
I stared at her, seeing the woman who had let the Rourkes belittle our lives, because it was easier than standing tall, and I felt the hard, cold truth settle in.
Forgive you, Mom, I said.
My voice steady against the wind, but I will never forget what your silence cost this family.
Big count.
She winced, then handed me the box which contained my father's pocket knife and a family photo that looked like it had been salvaged from a fire.
Thing.
Harlan appeared shortly after, his briefcase lighter, his face finally showing a flicker of peace.
Eagle.
Dale took the plea. He said, keeping his eyes on the water, 7 years no parole, and the Rourke Marine kits are being pulled from the shelves as fraudulent assets. I felt the last of the storm pass. But the calm was shattered by the screech of tires and the frantic, hollow sound of an engine dying on the hill.
Thanked.
Jay Rourke stumbled down the dock, his clothes disheveled, his eyes wild with the look of a man who had lost his kingdom and realized it was never his to begin with. "You think this makes you the winner?"
He shouted, his voice cracking.
"You ruined everything. You stole my name, my reputation, my father's legacy."
Theme.
The crowd drew back terrified, but I didn't flinch. I walked toward him, feeling the weight of my father's tools still humming in my mind. He swung a desperate, sloppy punch, and I didn't even have to think he caught his wrist,
You.
holding him at bay with the simple strength of a man who had built his own life from scratch. "This is the last lesson you'll ever get from me." "Jay," I said, my voice low and cutting,
Real men build, they don't destroy,
"and they certainly don't beg for the scraps of someone else's success." Sheriff Danner emerged from the crowd, his badge glinting in the sun, and ordered Jay to leave before he found himself in cuffs.
Feud.
As the squad car pulled him away, I looked back at the schooner, then at Walt, who was already untying the lines.
View 1.
I stepped onto the deck, the wood singing under my boots, and for the first time in my life, the horizon didn't look like a warning, it looked like a destination.
Feed.
The air in the harbor was heavy, thick with the scent of brine and the bitter tang of betrayal. Jace stood there, his face a mask of fractured pride, his hands trembling at his sides.
They knew that.
I stared at him, feeling the weight of the years he had stolen from my family's legacy.
You thought you could buy heritage.
I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a chisel through soft pine.
Thinked. You thought you could erase the calluses on my father's hands.
With your cheap, prefabricated plastic. Jace tried to step forward, his eyes darting toward the crowd that had gathered by the pier.
Control.
He spat out, his voice cracking under the pressure of his crumbling facade. "Then I replied, watching as the color drained from his face.
This is your last free lesson, Jace, I told him.
Stepping into his space. "Real men build with their souls, not their spreadsheets. They don't beg for scraps when they've lost the game."
Etions.
Behind me, the firm, authoritative footsteps of Sheriff Cal Danner echoed against the weathered planks of the dock.
Walk away.
"Rourke." Danner commanded, his gaze fixed on the man who had brought nothing but chaos to our quiet shores.
Fume.
Jace's breath came in ragged, desperate gasps as he looked at the ship he had tried to claim as his own. He stared at me, his mouth opening as if to offer a pathetic excuse, but the words died in his throat.
Eason.
He turned, his movements disjointed and weak, and stumbled back toward his sleek, overpriced car. Gravel sprayed into the air like buckshot as he tore away from the facility, leaving the scent of burning rubber in his wake.
Ooh.
Harlan appeared beside me, his presence as steady and comforting as the North Star. "You handled that better than any judge could have in a cold courtroom," he murmured, looking out at the bay.
For punishment and paperwork.
I replied, feeling the tension finally leave my shoulders. I wasn't looking for a sentence. I was looking for peace.
Yoon.
By dusk, the crowd had dissolved into the shadows, leaving the harbor to its natural rhythm. The schooner rocked gently on the incoming tide, its wooden hull catching the last rays of the dying sun.
Bington.
The sky burned down to a deep bruised gold, casting long silhouettes across the workshop floor. I walked back inside the space, finally feeling like home again. The air hummed with a quiet intensity, stripped of the shouting, the fake deals, and the ghosts of our past struggles. There was no noise, just the honest, patient work waiting for me at the workbench.
You.
I opened the old oak box one last time, resting my father's pocket knife beside his worn leather letter and his brass compass.
These were the pieces of his life.
Finally back where they belonged grounded in the foundation of the Rourke legacy. Outside, Claire stood near Mariana's car, the evening light softening the lines of worry on her face.
Bing.
"Thank you for letting me be here," she said. Her voice paused barely a whisper against the breeze. "Thank you for showing up," I replied, acknowledging the long road we had both traveled to reach this moment.
Themmed.
She gave a single knowing nod, turned, and climbed into the car. The taillights faded into the curve of the Bay Road, turning into pinpricks of light that eventually vanished into the night.
Youth.
I locked the heavy workshop doors and stood for a moment under the sign I had carved by hand. The wind carried the scent of sawdust and salt, a scent that meant the future was finally ours to hold.
Fiends.
The schooner glowed faintly under the pale moonlight, a shape meant to outlast the harshest storms. My father used to say that you don't measure the height of your success by what you earn in a quarter.
Fane.
It's measured by what still stands steady and proud long after.
You're gone.
I looked at the boat, the shop, and the legacy that had been reclaimed from the jaws of fraud.
Foundation, I said to the empty air.
Honoring the man who started it all. I built the fortress, and this time it'll stand forever. YouTube just dropped a new feature, and it's a game changer for stories like this.
You're hooked on this journey of redemption. Go ahead and smash that hype button.
It tells the algorithm that this story matters, and it helps ensure that even crazier, more powerful stories keep coming your way.